Last Tuesday, I watched my Aunt Vera get escorted off Jefferson High School property like a common criminal, carrying a small cardboard box that held 37 years of memories from a job that had become her entire life. The woman who raised me from age 8, who got up at 5 every morning to make sure our school halls were spotless before students arrived, was being fired by a principal who had been on the job for exactly 6 months. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. Principal Crawford told her it was about budget cuts while he stood next to his brand new $70,000 interactive whiteboard that nobody asked for, and most teachers didn't know how to use. My Aunt Vera, at 68 years old with arthritis making her hands shake as she signed her termination papers, just nodded quietly and thanked him for the opportunity to serve. That's the kind of person she was. That's the kind of person they threw away. I went to bed Monday night thinking this was just another story of corporate greed destroying good people. I figured we'd move on, find Vera another job somewhere, and try to forget how badly Jefferson High had treated the woman who cared about that place more than anyone in administration ever would. Then Wednesday morning changed everything I thought. I knew about my life. I was running late for chemistry class, rushing through the east hallway where Vera used to work her magic making everything shine, when this thunderous roaring sound shook every window in the building. The noise was so intense that car alarms started going off in the parking lot, and the fire alarm system nearly triggered from the vibrations. I looked out the hallway windows and saw something that made absolutely no sense in rural Ohio. A sleek black helicopter was descending onto our football field. Not some news chopper or medical emergency aircraft, but a corporate helicopter that belonged in Manhattan, not in our small town where the biggest excitement usually involved Friday night football games. The side of this machine had Meridian Industries painted in gold letters so large I could read them from 3 floors away. Every student in Jefferson High abandoned whatever they were supposed to be doing and pressed themselves against the nearest windows. Teachers left their classrooms mid-sentence. Even the cafeteria workers came running to see what was happening. And Principal Crawford, our arrogant administrator who thought he was too sophisticated for our little school, was practically sprinting across the parking lot toward that helicopter like his entire career suddenly depended on making a good impression. The helicopter settled onto our 50-yard line with the precision of a military operation. The rotors gradually slowed, but the anticipation in our school building kept building. Nobody knew what to expect. Then the aircraft door opened and a man stepped out who looked like he belonged on the cover of Fortune magazine. Expensive suit, confident stride, radiating the kind of authority that comes from controlling billion-dollar decisions. This man looked around our modest school campus, took in the aging brick buildings and the chain-link fences, and then he asked our principal a question that I'll never forget as long as I live. "Where is Vera Castellanos and why isn't she here?" Principal Crawford's face went white. His confident swagger disappeared instantly, and I realized that my quiet, humble aunt who had spent decades mopping floors and unclogging toilets was somehow connected to power that nobody at Jefferson High had ever imagined. The woman they had just discarded like outdated equipment was about to remind everyone why you should never judge people by the uniform they wear or assume you understand their story. What I discovered about my aunt that day didn't just change how I saw her. It changed how I understood the difference between a person's job and their worth, between what people appear to be and who they really are. And it taught me that sometimes the most powerful revenge comes not from fighting back, but from letting the truth speak for itself, because my Aunt Vera wasn't just a janitor. She was something that would make Principal Crawford wish he had never heard the name Jefferson High School. YouTube story. Outline, school expels elderly janitor the next morning. A billionaire's helicopter appears at the school. Hook first 10 seconds, expanded last Tuesday. I watched my Aunt Vera get escorted off Jefferson High School property like a common criminal, carrying a small cardboard box that held 37 years of memories from a job that had become her entire life. The woman who raised me from age 8, who got up at 5 every morning to make sure our school halls were spotless before students arrived, was being fired by a principal who had been on the job for exactly 6 months. Principal Crawford told her it was about budget cuts while he stood next to his brand new $70,000 interactive whiteboard that nobody asked for, and most teachers didn't know how to use. My Aunt Vera, at 68 years old with arthritis making her hands shake as she signed her termination papers, just nodded quietly and thanked him for the opportunity to serve. That's the kind of person she was. That's the kind of person they threw away. I went to bed Monday night thinking this was just another story of corporate greed destroying good people. I figured we'd move on, find Vera another job somewhere, and try to forget how badly Jefferson High had treated the woman who cared about that place more than anyone in administration ever would. Then Wednesday morning changed everything I thought I knew about my life. I was running late for chemistry class, rushing through the east hallway where Vera used to work her magic making everything shine, when this thunderous roaring sound shook every window in the building. The noise was so intense that car alarms started going off in the parking lot, and the fire alarm system nearly triggered from the vibrations. I looked out the hallway windows and saw something that made absolutely no sense in rural Ohio. A sleek black helicopter was descending onto our football field. Not some news chopper or medical emergency aircraft, but a corporate helicopter that belonged in Manhattan, not in our small town where the biggest excitement usually involved Friday night football games. The side of this machine had Meridian Industries painted in gold letters so large I could read them from 3 floors away. Every student in Jefferson High abandoned whatever they were supposed to be doing and pressed themselves against the nearest windows. Teachers left their classrooms mid-sentence. Even the cafeteria workers came running to see what was happening. And Principal Crawford, our arrogant administrator who thought he was too sophisticated for our little school, was practically sprinting across the parking lot toward that helicopter like his entire career suddenly depended on making a good impression. The helicopter settled onto our 50-yard line with the precision of a military operation. The rotors gradually slowed, but the anticipation in our school building kept building. Nobody knew what to expect. Then the aircraft door opened and a man stepped out who looked like he belonged on the cover of Fortune magazine. Expensive suit, confident stride, radiating the kind of authority that comes from controlling billion-dollar decisions. This man looked around our modest school campus, took in the aging brick buildings and the chain-link fences, and then he asked our principal a question that I'll never forget as long as I live. Where is Vera Castellanos, and why isn't she here? Principal Crawford's face went white. His confident swagger disappeared instantly, and I realized that my quiet, humble aunt who had spent decades mopping floors and unclogging toilets was somehow connected to power that nobody at Jefferson High had ever imagined. The woman they had just discarded like outdated equipment was about to remind everyone why you should never judge people by the uniform they wear or assume you understand their story. What I discovered about my aunt that day didn't just change how I saw her. It changed how I understood the difference between a person's job and their worth, between what people appear to be and who they really are. And it taught me that sometimes the most powerful revenge comes not from fighting back, but from letting the truth speak for itself. Because my Aunt Vera wasn't just a janitor. She was something that would make Principal Crawford wish he had never heard the name Jefferson High School. Introduction, setting the scene. Expanded to understand why that helicopter's arrival hit me like a punch to the gut. You need to know who Vera Castellanos really is to me. She's not just my aunt. She's the woman who saved my life when I was 8 years old and had nowhere else to go. My parents died in a house fire on a February night that I still dream about sometimes. Mom and Dad were asleep when an electrical fault in our basement turned our home into an inferno. I only survived because I was staying overnight at Vera's apartment that weekend. Something she insisted on every month because she said I needed adventure away from routine. What I thought was just a fun sleepover, with my favorite aunt turned out to be the reason I'm alive today. After the funeral, when social services started talking about foster care and splitting me up from everything familiar, Vera stepped forward without hesitation. She was 59 years old, single, living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on a custodian's salary, but she looked those caseworkers in the eye and said, "This boy has a home with me." She spent her life savings on lawyer fees to make the guardianship official, moved her sewing room into the living room so I could have my own bedroom, and never once made me feel like I was a burden. That's who Vera is. The kind of person who restructures her entire existence to give a traumatized kid stability and love. She's been working at Jefferson High since she was 31 years old, back when the building still had asbestos tiles, and the heating system required someone to manually adjust valves in the basement every morning. She started as a part-time evening custodian, working around night classes at the community college, and gradually earned her way up to head of maintenance. By the time I enrolled as a freshman 3 years ago, Vera knew every corner of that school better than anyone in administration. The thing about Vera is that she never did just the minimum. She unlocked classrooms at 6 in the morning for students who needed to make up tests. She stayed until 8 at night during homecoming week, making sure the decorations were perfect. When kids forgot their lunch money, somehow food appeared anyway, and Vera would just shrug and say the cafeteria had extras. I knew she was buying those meals with her own money, but she never wanted credit for it. She turned that school into her second home, and she treated every student like they were her responsibility. Teachers would joke that Vera knew more about what was happening in Jefferson High than the principal did, and they weren't wrong. She knew which kids were having trouble at home because they'd linger in the hallways instead of going to their cars. She knew which teachers were struggling with classroom management because she'd see the evidence in overturned desks and scattered papers. And she fixed problems quietly, without fanfare, because that's just what she did. Living with Vera taught me what real strength looks like. Every morning at 5:15, her alarm would go off, and she'd be up making coffee and breakfast, checking my homework, and reminding me about upcoming tests before heading to work by 6:30. Her hands started showing arthritis when I was in middle school, but she never complained. When I asked why she didn't find an easier job, she'd say, "This work matters, mijo. These kids deserve a clean, safe place to learn, and I'm good at providing that." I was proud of her, but I'll be honest, sometimes I was also embarrassed. When classmates would see her mopping the floors or emptying trash cans, treating her like she was invisible, I felt this confusing mix of anger and shame. I wanted people to see what I saw, a woman who worked harder than anyone I knew, who had sacrificed her own comfort to raise me, who cared more about Jefferson High than administrators who made 3 times her salary. But Vera never seemed bothered by other people's attitudes. She'd wave at me in the hallways, ask about my day, and treat every interaction like it mattered. She taught me that dignity comes from how you do your work, not what work you do. But I still wished the world could see her the way I did. Then Principal Crawford arrived 6 months ago, and everything started changing. Crawford came from some fancy district in Columbus, with big plans to modernize Jefferson High's operational efficiency. He spoke in corporate buzzwords, wore expensive suits that looked ridiculous in our small town, and immediately started making changes that had nothing to do with education and everything to do with impressing the school board. His first priority wasn't improving test scores or supporting teachers. It was redecorating his office with furniture that cost more than most of our teachers made in a month. Then came the smart boards that half the staff didn't know how to use. Then the new administrative efficiency protocols that mostly seemed designed to make everyone's job more complicated. And then he started looking at the custodial budget like it was his personal piggy bank for more impressive upgrades. Section 3. The Conflict. Rising Tension. 700 words. The trouble started with Nadia Brahms, a 15-year-old sophomore whose parents were too busy building their tech empire to notice their daughter was falling apart. I first heard about Nadia during one of my weekly dinner visits with my grandmother in February, when Zelda mentioned she was worried about one of the students. "There's this girl, Alex. Bright kid, comes from money, but something's not right. She's been skipping lunch, spending way too much time in the bathroom, and I found her crying in the supply closet yesterday." Zelda had always had radar for troubled kids, but this felt different. Over the next few weeks, her concern deepened. Nadia's grades were dropping, she was isolating herself from friends, and the classic signs of depression were becoming impossible to ignore. The problem was nobody else seemed to notice or care. Her parents are Vincent and Claire Brahms, Zelda explained during our next dinner. He's some hotshot at a venture capital firm. She runs a startup. They donated a new computer lab last year, which means the administration treats them like royalty. But that girl is drowning and no one's throwing her a lifeline. The situation escalated when Principal Sterling implemented what she called efficiency measures, designed to cut costs and eliminate waste. Among these was a new policy requiring strict inventory tracking of all food items, including staff meals in the teacher's lounge refrigerator. Every sandwich, every apple, every container of yogurt had to be logged and accounted for. "It's ridiculous," Zelda told me, shaking her head in frustration. "She's treating the place like a prison instead of a school. Now I have to fill out paperwork just to eat my lunch." But Sterling's micromanagement went deeper than food inventory. She'd been systematically making life difficult for longtime staff members, especially those she considered outdated or too familiar with students. Zelda, who had worked at the school for 12 years and was beloved by students, represented everything Sterling wanted to change about Riverside Academy's culture. The crisis reached its breaking point on a rainy Thursday in March. Nadia hadn't eaten lunch for 3 consecutive days, a fact that escaped the attention of teachers and counselors, but not my grandmother. When Zelda found Nadia hiding in the second-floor bathroom during lunch period, the girl was shaking and pale. "Honey, when did you last eat something?" Zelda asked gently. "I gave my lunch money to the homeless man outside the school," Nadia whispered. "He looked so hungry and I just couldn't walk past him again. But now I don't have anything and I'm too embarrassed to ask my parents for more money because they'll want to know where it went and they already think I'm irresponsible with everything. That's when my grandmother made the decision that would destroy her job and change everything. She went to the staff refrigerator, took her own turkey sandwich, and gave it to Nadia along with a bottle of water and an apple from her lunch bag. "You eat this right now," she said firmly. "And don't you worry about that homeless man. I'll make sure he gets fed too. But you cannot help others if you don't take care of yourself first." What Zelda didn't know was that Sterling had recently installed security cameras in the hallways as part of her modernization efforts. The footage clearly showed my grandmother taking food from the staff refrigerator, but it didn't capture the context or the conversation with Nadia. 2 days later, Sterling called an emergency meeting with Zelda in her office. I can still remember the phone call I received that afternoon, my grandmother's voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Alex, she fired me." She called it theft. I tried to explain about Nadia, about why the girl needed help, but Sterling cut me off, said it wasn't my job to play therapist to troubled rich kids. The confrontation had been brutal. Sterling had made it clear that she'd been looking for an excuse to get rid of my grandmother, and the missing sandwich provided the perfect opportunity. The fact that it was taken to help a struggling student was irrelevant to her. "Mrs. Porter," Sterling had said with cold satisfaction, "theft is theft. I don't care if it's a sandwich or a computer. This is a fireable offense, and frankly, it's time this school moved past the era of staff members who think they can parent our students." When Zelda tried to advocate for Nadia's well-being, Sterling's response was swift and cutting. "That's not your concern. You're here to clean floors and empty trash cans, not counsel students. We have trained professionals for that." The trained professionals, of course, had completely missed a 15-year-old girl's obvious signs of distress, but that detail seemed lost on Sterling. That evening, as I sat with my grandmother in her small apartment, while she packed up 12 years' worth of memories from Riverside Academy, I watched a woman who had never been defeated by anything struggle with the injustice of being punished for showing compassion. "Those kids need someone who sees them as more than test scores and tuition payments," she said quietly. "Sterling doesn't understand that buildings aren't the only things that need maintenance. Hearts and souls need care too. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Sonnet fa." Crawford's attack on the custodial staff started small, the way these things always do. First, he eliminated the part-time evening positions, claiming the school could optimize cleaning schedules for maximum efficiency. What that really meant was that Vera and the 2 remaining custodians now had to cover the work that 5 people used to do. I started noticing Vera coming home later and later, her arthritis visibly worse from the extra physical demands. When I asked if she wanted me to talk to someone about the increased workload, she just shook her head and said, "The school needs to save money, mijo. We all have to do our part." But I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The way she'd sit at our kitchen table rubbing her swollen knuckles while heating up dinner at 9 o'clock at night. Crawford wasn't done. He implemented new cleanliness standards that were impossible to meet with the reduced staff. Vera would get written up for things that had never been problems in 37 years. Dust on top of classroom cabinets that required a ladder to reach. Water spots on windows that faced the playground where kids constantly pressed their hands against the glass. Scuff marks in hallways that saw hundreds of sneakers every day. The write-ups came with increasing frequency. Mrs. Castellanos, the west hallway floor shows visible streaking under fluorescent lighting. This reflects poorly on our institutional standards and creates a negative impression for visiting parents. Crawford would hand her these formal reprimands with the cold efficiency of someone documenting a case for termination, which I now realize is exactly what he was doing. Vera started bringing cleaning supplies from home, spending her own money on industrial-grade floor polish and specialized window cleaner that wasn't in the school's budget. She'd arrive at work 30 minutes early and stay an hour late, desperately trying to meet standards that Crawford kept raising every time she came close to achieving them. It was psychological warfare disguised as performance management. The breaking point came during November's school board meeting. I didn't attend, but Vera did, because Crawford had put facility optimization on the agenda. She came home that night looking like someone had physically struck her. "What happened?" I asked, helping her out of her coat. "He presented his budget proposal," she said quietly. "He wants to eliminate my position and contract custodial services to an outside company. Says it will save the district $40,000 a year." I did the math quickly. "But your salary is only $32,000. The outside company will pay their workers minimum wage and provide no benefits," Vera explained. "Crawford gets to claim credit for cost savings while the actual cleaning gets worse. But the school board loves numbers that look good on paper." What infuriated me most was the hypocrisy. While Crawford was eliminating Vera's job to save money, he'd just spent $60,000 renovating his office. New hardwood floors, leather furniture, and a coffee machine that cost more than some of our teachers' monthly paychecks. He justified it as creating a professional environment for important meetings, but the only meetings I ever saw in that office involved him talking to district administrators about his next career move. The termination. Email arrived on a Friday afternoon in December. The kind of cowardly timing that corporations use when they want to minimize confrontation. Vera was at work when she received it, and I found out when she came home 2 hours early. Moving like someone in a daze. "They're outsourcing custodial services effective January 15th, she said, setting her phone on our kitchen counter like it contained a bomb. "My last day is January 12th. 37 years, and they're giving me 3 weeks' notice in an email." I read the message over her shoulder, feeling my anger build with every corporate buzzword. Cost-effective solutions for facility maintenance. Streamlined. Operational efficiency. Appreciation for your years of service. Not one word acknowledged. What Vera actually meant to Jefferson High or the students, whose lives she'd touched. The cruelest part was the timing. Vera had been planning to work until she was 71 to qualify for full pension benefits. Being terminated at 68 meant she'd lose thousands of dollars in retirement income, money she'd earned through decades of faithful service. Crawford had to know this, had to understand he was stealing from a woman who'd given her life to that school. But he didn't care. "I can't afford to retire yet," Vera told me that night, showing me the pension calculations she'd been working on for months. "I'll have to find another job, but who's going to hire a 68-year-old custodian with arthritis?" I wanted to storm into Crawford's office and tell him exactly what I thought of his efficiency measures. But Vera stopped me. "Don't make trouble for yourself, mijo. These people have power, and they use it to crush anyone who challenges them. I just need to accept this and move on. That's when I realized Crawford hadn't just fired my aunt. He'd broken her spirit. The sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the morning air brought every conversation at Riverside Academy to a dead stop. I was sitting in my car in the visitor parking lot, having driven over to see if I could somehow salvage my grandmother's reputation, when the aircraft appeared over the tree line like something out of a movie. The helicopter was sleek, black and expensive looking, the kind that screamed serious money. It circled the campus once before settling down on the athletic field, right in the middle of where the soccer team usually practiced. Through my windshield, I watched students and teachers stream out of buildings, pointing and talking excitedly as the rotors wound down. What happened next made my heart stop. The helicopter door opened, and out stepped Thomas Morrison himself, the tech billionaire whose face graced magazine covers and conference stages around the world. But that wasn't the part that made me grip my steering wheel until my knuckles went white. It was the woman who stepped out beside him, wearing an elegant navy business suit I'd never seen before, her silver hair styled perfectly, walking with the confident posture of someone who belonged in boardrooms and corporate headquarters. It was my grandmother, but not the grandmother I knew. This was someone else entirely. I stumbled out of my car and followed the crowd toward the athletic field, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Principal Sterling was hurrying across the grass in her high heels, her face a mixture of confusion and panic as she approached two people who clearly outranked her in ways she was just beginning to understand. "Ms. Sterling," Morrison said, his voice carrying easily across the field as more students and faculty gathered around them. "I believe you know my mother." The word mother hit the crowd like a physical force. I watched Sterling's face go white as she looked back and forth, between the billionaire CEO and the woman she'd humiliated, and fired less than 24 hours earlier. "Students and faculty of Riverside Academy," Morrison continued, his arm moving protectively around my grandmother's shoulders. "I'd like you to properly introduce you to Dr. Zelda Morrison Porter, former Chief Technology Officer of Morrison Technologies and co-founder of the company that probably manufactured half the devices in your pockets right now." The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word. I could see students looking at my grandmother with new eyes, trying to reconcile the woman who had cleaned their classrooms and slipped them encouraging notes. With the tech pioneer standing before them, my mother stepped away from the corporate world 15 years ago to raise her grandson. "After a family tragedy," Morrison said, and I felt every eye briefly turn toward me as I stood frozen at the edge of the crowd. When she took the position here as head custodian, it wasn't because she needed the job. It was because she believed in the mission of education and wanted to contribute to young people's lives. Sterling finally found her voice, stammering, "Mr. Morrison, I had no idea. If we had known who she was—" "That's exactly the problem," Morrison cut her off, his voice sharp enough to cut steel. "You fired a woman for feeding a hungry student without knowing anything about her character, her background, or her motivations. You saw a 73-year-old custodian and decided her compassion was theft. That's when Nadia Brahm stepped forward from the crowd of students. The 15-year-old girl looked tiny next to the adults, but her voice was strong and clear as she addressed everyone gathered on the field. "Mrs. Porter saved my life," Nadia said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I wasn't eating because I was giving my lunch money to homeless people, and I was too embarrassed to tell anyone I was hungry. She noticed when no one else did. She made sure I had food and never made me feel ashamed about it." My grandmother's composure finally cracked. She reached out and pulled Nadia into a gentle hug, and I could see tears in her eyes as she whispered something in the girl's ear that made her nod and smile through her tears. Morrison looked directly at Sterling, his expression cold and businesslike. "Mr. Sterling, effective immediately, you're relieved of your duties as principal. The board will be receiving a full report about your leadership failures, and my legal team will be addressing the wrongful termination of my mother." He turned back to the crowd, his voice warming as he addressed the students. "The Morrison Foundation will be investing significantly in Riverside Academy's future, with one non-negotiable condition. My mother will oversee all student welfare initiatives. ensuring that no child in this school ever goes unnoticed, unfed, or uncared for again. The cheers that erupted from the students were deafening. Section 6. The Aftermath. Lessons and Conclusion. 700 words. 6 months after the helicopter landing that changed everything, I walked into Riverside Academy's main hallway and barely recognized the place. Where sterile motivational posters once hung, student artwork now covered the walls alongside photos of community service projects and peer mentoring programs. The atmosphere felt warmer, more alive, like a school that actually cared about the humans inside it instead of just test scores and fundraising goals. The transformation had been swift and complete. Principal Sterling's termination made headlines in educational circles, especially when the wrongful termination lawsuit revealed a pattern of staff mistreatment that went back years. 3 other employees came forward with similar stories of being dismissed for showing compassion that Sterling deemed inappropriate. The school board settled out of court and issued a public apology, but the damage to Sterling's career was permanent. She never worked in education again. My grandmother's new office sat where Sterling's used to be, but you'd never confuse the 2 spaces. Instead of intimidating mahogany furniture and diplomas covering every wall, Zelda had filled the room with comfortable chairs, plants, and a coffee station that was always stocked with cookies. Students wandered in and out throughout the day, some seeking advice, others just needing a quiet place to decompress. The Porter programs, as they'd become known, were being studied by school districts across the country. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. What if schools treated facility maintenance and student welfare as interconnected systems? Custodians received training in recognizing signs of student distress. Cafeteria workers learned to identify kids who might be food insecure. Bus drivers became the first line of defense for spotting bullying or family problems. But the real magic happened in smaller moments. I witnessed it during my weekly visits to have lunch with my grandmother in her new role as Director of Student Life and Wellness. Students would knock on her door with problems ranging from academic stress to family crises, and she'd listen with the same focused attention she'd once given to debugging computer code. Mrs. Porter, a junior named Marcus Chen, said during one of my visits, "My parents are getting divorced, and I don't know how to tell my friends without them feeling sorry for me." "Marcus," she replied, setting down her coffee and giving him her complete attention, "there's a difference between people feeling sorry for you and people caring about you. The right friends will want to support you, not pity you." It was the same wisdom she'd given me 20 years earlier when kids at school teased me about being raised by my grandmother instead of having normal parents. The most dramatic change was in Nadia Brahms, who had transformed from a withdrawn, struggling student into a confident peer counselor. She'd started an organization called the Visibility Project, aimed at helping students who felt overlooked or forgotten. The group met weekly in my grandmother's office, sharing strategies for supporting classmates who might be struggling in silence. "Your grandmother taught me that being invisible isn't the same as being powerless," Nadia told me during one of these meetings. "Sometimes the people others don't notice are the ones who see everything most clearly." The Morrison Foundation's investment had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as funding for student welfare programs evolved into a model campus that attracted educators from around the world. Tom Morrison visited quarterly, not as a celebrity CEO, but as a son checking on his mother's latest project. During one of these visits, I finally got the full story of why my grandmother had hidden her past for so long. We were sitting in her apartment, the same small place she'd lived in for 15 years, surrounded by photos of students alongside pictures of our family. "Alex, when your parents died, I had a choice to make," she said, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold while she talked. "I could stay in the corporate world and hire nannies to raise you, or I could step away and be the grandmother you needed. It wasn't even a difficult decision, but you gave up everything. Your career, your recognition, your fortune." She smiled the same way she had when I was 8 years old and worried about being different from other kids. "Honey, I gave up nothing that mattered. I spent 40 years building technology to connect people, but raising you taught me that the most important connections happen face-to-face, heart-to-heart. She gestured toward a wall covered with thank you notes from students, artwork from kids she'd helped, and photos from graduation ceremonies where young people had specifically requested that Grandma Z be in their family pictures. This is my real legacy. Not patents or profit margins, but knowing that I helped young people believe in themselves when the world seemed determined to overlook them. The final piece of the story came a year later, when Riverside Academy unveiled a permanent installation in the main lobby, the Zelda Porter Center for Student Excellence, where every child matters. Below the plaque, my grandmother sits at her desk every day, still keeping a bowl of candy handy and wearing comfortable shoes. Officially titled but universally known as the woman who proved that the most powerful force in any school isn't money or technology, it's someone who notices when others don't.